Welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast, where we deep dive into the best matches in AEW history. Brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network and your host, Sam Brown. Hello and welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast. I'm your host, Sam Brown. Thank you for joining me. Every episode, alongside a special guest, I take an in-depth look at one of the best matches in AEW history. If you enjoy the show today, you can subscribe or rate it on your podcast app of choice, support the podcast financially through Red Circle, and make sure you check out all of the other great shows on the Social Suplex Podcast Network, where we cover all aspects of the world of pro wrestling. We've got One Nation Radio, Keeping It Strong Style, All Things Elite, Tunnel Talk, the Trish and Sarah Wrestling Podcast, Wrestle Art with Chris Things, and Imp's WWE Adventure. You can become part of the Social Suplex community by joining our Discord and check out the awesome Match Guide and Social Suplex merch on Chopped Tees. Links for all of these things are in the podcast description. My guest for today is coming out of retirement. It's a former columnist from Lords of Pain and podcaster for the Right Side of the Pond on LOP Radio. It's Maverick, and we are discussing Jon Moxley versus Bryan Danielson from Revolution 2020. Mav, you part-timer, you're coming back, taking the spots of good old-fashioned, full-time, everyday podcasters. It's been a while since you've done one of these, my friend.
Thank you. The edge of AEW podcasting, just turning up after it's all been set up to take other people's spots. It's funny. Obviously we finished our podcast after 7 years. Just at the dawn of 2020, so just before the pandemic, we finished up having kind of been along for the ride with with the authority and all of the stuff that came with that kind of, I guess, that quite neatly framed our little run. But then we come back every now and again and do a little special. So we did do a 2-part WrestleMania special, and when something's interesting, we will come back out of the woodwork. So actually, we've had some brief discussions about doing another one, pretty soon. But I'll sort of keep that under wraps for now.
Yeah. For those who don't know him and don't even know the sort of the history of my own work, writing and talking about wrestling online, Mav and I both wrote for Lords of Pain. Maverick, for quite a lengthy time, you were on the main page there writing about the WWE primarily, and then of course the Right Side of the Pond podcast with the rest of your crew. And for those who don't know, these guys were very, very formative in encouraging me when I first started writing about wrestling, and I've always enjoyed talking to these guys and writing with these guys. Mav and I did a Dean Ambrose collaborative column at one point when he left the WWE, his best singles matches in the WWE. I'm really glad you're on here today, Mav, particularly because, and it's a bit of a different one to what we normally do. Mav, you're not someone who regularly watches AEW, are you? You're sort of someone who'll take a recommendation, most of the time probably from me, I'm guessing, and have a dip in every now and again, and then a dip out when you're not feeling it.
It's interesting. I actually watched the first 2 official pay-per-views. So the one where Cody destroys the throne, whichever one that would have been called, and
Double or Nothing 2019.
That was the one, and then the one with a little bit of the bubbly and Jericho beating Omega. I watched those 2 because I was interested, and obviously at the time WWE was absolutely awful, and I was definitely checking out, was ready for a break, and I kind of just wanted to sort of have a bit of I was nosy as much as anything else, and there was a lot of stuff on those shows that I did enjoy, but I think I was just done with wrestling generally at that point. I did need like a proper break, and my colleague from the Right Side of the Pond fan called it decompressing, and it did feel like that because we had this period of time talking about wrestling every week, writing about it every week, certainly watching Raw every week, sometimes SmackDown as well, all the pay-per-views, talking about them, And, it was quite heartbreaking in a lot of ways, because obviously you had this, what I would consider one of WWF's best periods between, let's say June of 2011 and, the end of 2016. And then this sort of gradual decline, which then became quite a fast decline into a fairly unwatchable product. So at that point, I did just need to walk away and not watch wrestling for a little bit. I've since kind of caught up with pretty much everything that's happened WWE wise. I'm still not, back to being an avid or week to week watcher. Still love my back catalogue. I'll still watch lots of classics. I keep the network just so I can watch all the, matches and pay-per-views from down the years that I love. But yeah, when AEW has something that's good, and I'll definitely always watch anything you send me, and I'll see people retweet things, or I follow a lot of the wrestlers that were in WWE and are now in AEW, and I'll sort of see things that they might retweet or things that they might post, and if something's interesting, or one of the dirt sheet headlines look interesting, I'll always delve into it. Like, ultimately, I'm not a tribal person. Like, my background is WWF from 1990 onwards, but I've always kind of watched bits and bobs of WCW when that was a thing, and bits and bobs of ECW when that was a thing. And if someone sends me a match and says this is good, have a look, then I'll always give it a watch and try and be open-minded. So yeah, definitely not a tribal wrestling fan. It's just that so happens that most of the performers that I really like have, generally speaking, worked in in the WWF WWE landscape, and if they've gone to another company, I'll often follow them along. Actually, I did watch a lot of TNA between, I don't know, let's say 2010 and 2013. There was some really good stuff going on around then. So yeah, I'm not tribal. I'll watch anything people kind of send me along. So, and there's definitely been some stuff of AEW's that I've really, really enjoyed, and certainly with the two wrestlers we're discussing today, two of my all-time favorites. So.
It's interesting. One of the maddening things for us all at the end of the 2010s was how we could see the potential in this generation of wrestlers that is coming through. Particularly we, you, myself, the Mazza and Plan from the right side of the pond. We all just loved the Shield, and we're just like, these are the guys. Just go commit to them. And every time we thought they'd commit to them, you'd have a part-timer come back or something would happen, and that was one of the maddening things. And even I remember I think it was Plan dubbed it like the Renaissance the Renaissance era back in 2018, which was something that Cody Rhodes tried to get off the ground after the most recent WrestleMania. He tried to call it a Renaissance, dub it the Renaissance era before the corporate kind of got in and started calling it the Triple H era or the Paul Levesque era. But it's interesting how that we, for so long, were like screaming, and we both dealt with it in very different ways. When the WWE went completely to shambles, I kind of went off into New Japan and then AEW. You sort of just tapped out of wrestling altogether and were like, okay, well, I'll focus on other hobbies that I've got. I like other things in my life. I'm not going to keep punishing myself. But now you can see it is kind of blossoming. It blossomed for AEW sooner because they didn't have the handbrake that was Vince McMahon sitting in creative. But now the handbrake is off the WWE. You can see how engaged they are, and it's because, surprise, surprise, they've gone with this incredible generation of talent and they've committed to them, and it's absolutely blossomed for them and bloomed for them. And it's kind of been cool to see, even though I'm not watching the WWE really at all that much. Well, I'm watching, the odd match and the WrestleManias, the biggest shows, but it is still cool to see, guys like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn coming to the fore, and Roman Reigns, everything he's doing, in terms of dominating the main event scene over there, and really coming into his own and putting his own stamp on things, has been really fantastic to see. And we're going to talk about the AEW side of it, but it bears mentioning that, we didn't all have to be driven away for this to happen, but it's kind of cool that it has happened. And the WWE's creative has really blossomed in ways that we kind of really, really were hoping to see.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did, funny enough, we did a special on the 10-year anniversary of the Shield's debut last November, and it was really interesting to talk about it. And in that podcast, we talked about how actually all three of them have, ascended to the tops of their respective companies and become everything that we always thought that they were. I guess the frustration, in that kind of 2019 particularly was, how that last 12 months of Dean Ambrose / Jon Moxley's contract was handled. That was a particular frustration to me because he was my favourite, and having seen it happen with Punk, and then who was also my favourite, and then to see it happen with him was particularly galling, and probably the thing that drove me away more than anything else, actually. And I remember when he did the podcast with Jericho, and soon after, they had the vignette that announced that he'd signed with AEW, and I watched the first show that he was on. I watched, and it was great that he had this motivation and this kind of desire to prove to Vince McMahon and anybody else that doubted him as a sort of because he was a main event guy at WWE. I mean, it shouldn't be forgotten that for all of the ills of 2019, Ambrose was an absolute star in WWE and a world champion, and somebody who provided huge amounts of value to the product in that time. I actually think that his exit angle is looked on slightly unfairly, and that's probably a topic for another day. But yeah, he came into AEW. It's great to see him have that motivation to say, look, this is for want of a better word, the brass ring, and I'm going to grasp it, and I'm just going to tear it up with absolutely everybody in here. And what he was always really good at was making other people look good. And I know that he's done that with some sort of mid-card performers in AEW and really kind of helped to elevate them. And that's why, like, Plan and I always used to compare Mox to, if you compare him to anybody, he's Bret Hart. Actually, people always go with Stone Cold or Roddy Piper. But in terms of philosophically where he sits, somebody that takes the business uber seriously, somebody that sees it as a trade, somebody that sees it as something that you give back to, somebody that sees it as your duty as a locker room leader to help others, elevate others, or punish people that aren't taking the business seriously. Like, he's the new Bret Hart.
It's interesting how there was sort of a bit of a Bret Hart renaissance at one point in AEW. You had, CM Punk doing Bret Hart tribute acts, sort of tribute matches, Dax Harwood and Cash Wheeler as well. I think at one point they even had a shirt that said like Sons of Bret or something along those lines. And Dean and Jon Moxley's name was never mentioned in that, but it's a comparison I've made as well. Particularly when you look at one thing that I think is very common, that they very much have in common is their selling, and how they sell, and how committed they are to that. It's one of the things that I really think is underrated about Moxley. Everyone talks about his, his violence, but the way that he draws people into his selling, I think is underrated. And we're going to kind of talk about that in this match, I think. And when we break it down, I'd also like to ask, you've sort of talked a bit about Jon Moxley, Dean Ambrose, who was both of our favorite wrestler in WWE. But, Danielson, he's another wrestler that you covered pretty extensively while you're writing about the WWE and podcasting about it. What's sort of your history with him been, and your thoughts of, him going to AEW? What's that been like for you?
Well, it's interesting, actually. I obviously I wasn't a watcher really of indie wrestling of the mid to late 2000s at all. I've watched some since, particularly some of the, Danielson, McGuinness stuff and things like that, I guess you just get those recommendations over the years, don't you? But it certainly wasn't something I was watching at the time. So really my first experience of him was that NXT back when it was a weird game show, as opposed to the kind of, feeder promotion that it became. It was that sort of very strange time. Will we ever know if the firing of Bryan for spitting in someone's face in that initial Nexus angle, was that a work or not? Will we ever know? So I really enjoyed his work there. I mean, my gut instinct watching him in 2010 was he's probably too small, even post Benoit and Guerrero. He's probably too small for them to ever, take seriously. But he was so good that they had to. And it was it was that sort of period where he had that bragging rights match with Dolph Ziggler, which, funny enough, I've seen a lot of chatter about in recent days. I think Ziggler was tweeting about the anniversary of it. But if that's a match then that people haven't watched in a while, I did rewatch it when Ziggler mentioned it, and my God, it stands up incredibly well. What a match. And he just basically built his reputation in WWE the old-fashioned way. He had the best match on the card most times when he was featured. He did everything that he was given and did it to the best of his ability. He took sometimes fairly bad creative and made it good. And by doing that, through a US title run here and a tag team title run there, and his partnership with Kane and his heel run with AJ as his valet, he just got so over with the crowd, and he became one of the most beloved faces in WWE history. And I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know here. But what was really underrated about him, I think, was the way that he actually made so many different characters stick. And when we come on to this match, what I was really fascinated by was this was a Danielson character we never got to see in WWE, because obviously you had various shades of heel Daniel Bryan, as obviously his ring name in WWE. Like you had the the Earth Champion, Eco Warrior character, which I think was probably his favourite to play from what I've read. You had obviously the sort of WrestleMania 28 losing in how many seconds it was version, which might actually be my favourite version of him. And then you obviously had the kind of tweener version with Kane, and then of course like the full blown crazy over babyface that he got in SummerSlam 2013. So yeah, different versions of his character, and I think he is most underrated probably for his character wrestling because he is such a good in-ring performer. The fact that he's actually played so many different characters and so many shades of different characters, he doesn't get the credit for that say a Jericho gets, but actually you have to sort of say he ranks alongside someone like Jericho in that respect. He's incredibly versatile, can play a character across all shades of the spectrum, from despised heel to beloved babyface, and all the shades in between that as well. So that's probably what he's most underrated for. I loved also the way he went out with WWE. Like he got really over again just before he left. So his last act while he ran down his contract was to cement Reigns as the kind of final boss again, to kind of use a phrase, by having that match where he racked and stacked them. So that for that to be his final act, I thought was tremendously generous as well. So obviously a guy that's had a unbelievably storied career, from King of the Indies to the very top of the most mainstream wrestling promotion to somebody finishing out his career and just having a good time in AEW. I guess the only misgiving I have is him coming back from the injuries and concussions and so on. I've read recently that he needs more surgery, and I hope that he doesn't regret the comebacks later in life, because that we know that wrestling is very addictive to those that love it as much as he did, and you don't want to see his health compromised. So that's the only misgiving I'd have about the sort of later part of his AEW career, I suppose.
Yeah, a few things you mentioned there that I'll kind of just add to, but specifically, I understand exactly where you're coming from with the return from injury. It's this is a guy who he went to extraordinary lengths to try and to get himself back, and had to really do a lot to convince the WWE to let him get back in the ring. And for that alone, you can see just how brightly the fire burns within him. And I'm not sure what your stance on it all is, Mav. For me, I'm very much like, look, these wrestlers, they know the score, like, and in some ways you kind of just got to let them do it, and with precaution. And I think, for me at least, I think AEW used him sparingly enough in terms of how often he was wrestling and that sort of thing, and giving him breaks that I was comfortable with where he ended up. But I understand what you're saying. When you read, he now needs neck surgery. What's that going to mean for him in the future? And I hope this retirement that he's done is something that's going to stick, and is something that, because it seemed, the AEW made a big deal of it. It seems like it was a big deal to his family, and you hope that he is one of the wrestlers where, it doesn't become something he just is constantly returning to. To kind of zag back and just mention, you mentioned character as well. One of the interesting things about his run in AEW, which we'll sort of talk about after this when we talk about a bit of the legacy of the BCC, has been like his adaptability has almost been, in some ways, almost a weakness in AEW, because his character has flitted back and forth from being a face and a heel a number of times within his time in AEW, and I suspect that has actually been to the detriment of some of the stuff he's been doing. But then the work that he does once he's going back and once he's into it and in the ring is so undeniable that it's hard to know how much it has mattered. But he's certainly gone. That adaptability has certainly been on display with him wrestling, as a beloved face and also as a, despicable heel going up against the heroes of the company at different points.
Yeah, I think that's a problem modern wrestling has generally, is that there are probably too many fast shifts of character. Like if you watch, and again, for anyone listening that did listen to the pod, I don't know if there is.
Get your bingo card out, guys. Jen thinks
but if
you get crossed off.
Bingo, Pom Bingo is about to start. If you watch Bret Hart's arc through the New Generation period, what happens in 1997 is not a sudden departure. He's actually the same character all the way through that period. It's not Bret Hart that changes, it's the landscape around him that means that what was considered heroic is now considered heelish, and vice versa. Stone Cold Steve Austin, had he been playing the character he played in 1992, would have been firmly a heel. In 1997, those antics are being cheered, and the whole kind of point of Bret's angle in 1997 is he was right. This is him saying, like, I haven't changed, you've changed. Like, crowds are the problem, you are the problem. And so that was why it was so effective, because you saw the frustration and the rage and the confusion and the absolute sort of disgust in him build, But effectively, he had played the same character from when he debuts with the company in the mid-80s, like until he left. And that's why, if you watch Wrestling with Shadows, like that's why. I mean, he will never get over what happened to him in Montreal, because he felt like that character had been taken out into the middle of the ring and shot. Those were his exact words on the documentary. They might as well have just taken that character to the middle of the ring and shot him, because that's what they've done. So I think, someone like Bryan kind of being written into lots of twists and turns doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, because he is the sort of character who, when he had his peak run in WWE, it was effectively the character he played as a heel becoming a face, in a similar way to Bret Hart. So yeah, I can see how if they had him maneuvering around too many different changes of character, however well he plays them, I could see how that could be, less effective. But I certainly found, watching this angle through, I found the character he was playing like really fascinating. So yeah, looking forward to talking about that.
Well, let's get into it. We've got through maybe half an inch of my dot points of for this thing so far. So let's get to the actual match we're talking about, or the build to the match we're talking about today. Of course, for those of you who were listening at the start, Jon Moxley versus Bryan Danielson, Revolution 2022. Of course, the build for this match comes off the back of Jon Moxley's returning from a stint of rehab in 2022. It's, him going away, announcing it. It came very abruptly. He was in the middle of a tournament at the time, but it was at a really a great time for men talking about mental health, particularly in people in wrestling talking about it. There was, at the time, Eddie Kingston also wrote an article in Player Tribune about his struggles that he'd had with his mental health issues, and how how pivotal his professional career and professional wrestling had been in helping him overcome those things, and how thankful he was that he had been able to find a place where he could wrestle in AEW. And then, of course, at the same time, we knew this was happening with Jon Moxley, and there was various wrestlers that spoke about it in the ring, and sort of gave Jon Moxley props for dealing with the things that were, affecting his real life, and trying to get over those demons that have plagued wrestling for so long and have been the downfall of many wrestlers. So it was very triumphant when Jon Moxley returned. It was, very early in the year. His music hits. He comes out to the ring. He immediately looked different from what he'd looked like before he'd left for rehab. He looked lean. He had a bit of a twinkle in his eye, I felt like. Maybe that's just me reading into it. But he had a bit of a twinkle in his eye. He gets in the ring, and one of the first things he does is tells a heckler to fuck off, which is just absolutely incredible. What a way to get back in. But then, I wanted to talk about this promo, because this is a man that has cut like more great promos than I could number. And I reckon this is one of his best in terms of what it does. He talks about a black cloud hanging over him, a demon, a dream he had of a black cloud, a demon that was following him around and taunting him, kind of saying, you thought you could get out of this business, you thought you could get out of it all and just get away from all of this. You're never going to escape me. And Mox talks about how everyone has scars on the outside of their body. He's got more than most, but it's the scars on the inside that are so important. They're the ones that people shouldn't hide, because those scars make people who they are. He says that he thanks the fans that followed him, and he talks to the people who doubt him. And he said to those people who write him off, the ones who doubt him, they can shove it right up their asses, just like he told that demon. He can shove that up his ass. And then he says in 2022, he's going to go on a pilgrimage. He's going to grab wrestling by the balls and do whatever he wants, because now more than ever, he is free. And if people thought he was dangerous before, he says, I'm thirsty, but now all I drink is blood. Mav, what a promo to come back. There's so many images in it, so many layers to the things that he's saying. What did you think of this promo?
Oh, it's absolutely fantastic. People have often compared him to Piper, and I've never really felt that was that great a comparison, truthfully. But this is a very Piper-esque promo, probably the most Piper-esque promo I've seen him do. I'd say it's the delivery of it's very old school. Like the cadence of it, the delivery of it, I felt was very 80s, like in a really good way. Because obviously a lot of modern promos are quite formulaic. I on the pod I always used to compare it to, like, if you fire up, like, I think it was like WWE like 2K17 and 18, right? That you in the universe page you could cut a promo and they would give you like 4 options and you picked which option you wanted your creator wrestler or whatever to say, and then it would give you 4 more options and you were meant to like match it up so it came up with a coherent promo. But it was also quite funny to choose completely mismatching statements.
I know exactly what you're talking about, man.
And I often feel like modern promos, weirdly enough, it was such a good accurate representation of what modern promos are often like. This was much more, it felt more freeform. It felt like somebody speaking from the heart and, explaining what they've been through and the motivation they now have to take their career forward. I thought it was really interesting how he shows up all in black. It almost looks like the first Shield gear that he wore. I don't know if anyone remembers, but when the Shield debuted, they weren't wearing like the vests and stuff to begin with. Like, he was Ambrose in particular. You think he shows up in like a turtleneck?
Yeah, it's a turtleneck.
And it was kind of very similar. He was just wearing, all black clothes, really kind of like, really simple. And the metaphors that he draws here are really interesting because they actually follow the angle all the way through. So, the kind of all I drink is blood reference, obviously then the match itself is very bloody. And there's a moment with, Danielson's got Mox's blood all over his own face, which I thought was quite a nice link all the way through. I thought the "I don't run from demons, I just beat the shit out of them" line was appropriate, and also kind of gives us the sense that they've used the real life circumstances, but they've contextualized it for wrestling. They haven't just gone like fully off kayfabe. They've made sure that it's tied in properly, because sometimes when you talk about wrestlers' real lives, I feel like it can be to the detriment of the product. I think one of the real problems wrestling has had, let's say since about 2002, is that how you deal with kayfabe in a world where everyone knows that everything is kayfabe, and wrestlers no longer have to travel in separate face and heel cars and not be seen with each other in public and live their gimmick 24/7. Like, in a world where that no longer is the case, what do you do with kayfabe, and what do you do with this idea of, this was the whole reality era idea in WWE. It was like, what do you do with these ideas that people think they know everything that happens backstage? They don't, but you know enough that you think you know. So obviously the whole B+ player thing with, the Daniel Bryan character in WWE was like, that was precisely concocted because angry fans thought that that's how he was being treated. And so Stephen Trips went out on TV every week and said it. And it was brilliant. So that's one case of it working really well. Lots of other cases it doesn't work at all well. So what do you do with that, basically? And I think this was a nice happy medium. Everyone knows he's gone to rehab. You have to acknowledge it in some way. So why not make it his motivation to beat everybody up for a whole year?
Yeah. And I just love, man, the final line. Every time I watch it, I get goosebumps. Like the genius of that line, "I'm thirsty." Like, this is a person who's been off because of alcohol addiction. And when he said that, the first time I heard, I'm like, what on earth is this man talking about? Like, I'm thirsty. And then the response, all I drink is blood. And it's just so unapologetic because at this point there's been that criticism out there that, it was the criticism very early came from Vince McMahon himself. It's a blood and guts company. We want to have nothing to do with that blood and guts. And then, that took hold, and there was a lot of criticism around the AEW's usage of blood. And I'm going to keep saying Dean Ambrose and Jon Moxley for just while I'm talking to you, Mav. There's never been a problem before until you came on the show, mate.
Funny enough, I think I've managed to keep to Mox mostly.
Yeah, I know. It's me that's stumbling. But just how unapologetic it is, and like this is me. This is my mission statement for the year. I am free. Because he, leaving the WWE, he talked about that freedom, and you got a sense of that in even just the way he stood on the ropes at Double or Nothing in 2019. He breathed in air, and it was like he's breathing free air for the first time. He's unchained. He is able to do what he wants. He called it a paradigm shift, and now he's saying, look, now, you thought I was dangerous before when I was the champion of this company, when I was dominating at the top. But now I'm even more free than what I was then. I'm even more able to do what I want to do whenever I want to do it. And I'm up for this. I'm thirsty, but I'm just thirsty for blood now. And I don't have this demon that was dragging me down anymore. I just love the amount of layers that is in this promo with how, and as a fan of his, like as someone who, probably, if I'm honest with myself, has a very parasocial relationship with this man. To hear him speak this way it was very emotional at the time when he thanked fans for standing by him and never doubting him. And then when he said these things, like it was like, yes, my guy, he's out there and he is better and he's about to do anything he wants. And throughout this year, this is a big year for him in terms of what he went on to do. I just constantly went back to this promo and I posted on social media so many times, just being like, this is what this man said he's going to do. And look what he's doing right now. This promo, for me, it's brilliant. I'll never forget how I felt the first time I listened to it and watched it. And I will often go back to this promo as, just something that just gives me so much motivation and just makes me feel very excited for pro wrestling.
Yeah, I think the best promos do that. They're inspiring, and that's why you remember them. Like your favorite promos, you remember like song lyrics. They will stay with you. And I think with this one, what I also really liked was that he wasn't interrupted. Like the interruption of a promo thing is so overdone in pro wrestling, and this wasn't attached to an angle at this point. It was just Jon Moxley returns, he comes out, he gives a 6 or 7 minute promo, he goes to the back, and then that's it for a week or two. And that's actually a creative bravery that I think is quite impressive, because it'd been really easy to bring him out there and then immediately for someone to come out and go, well, you're not ready for me. And they resisted the temptation to do that. And I think that's laudable, actually.
Well, let's move along. Let's bring Danielson into the picture, and we'll get to the more direct build of the match. That sort of definitely foreshadows what's about to happen. And if you know anything about wrestling, there's a pay-per-view in about coming up in about 6 or 7 weeks' time. I bet Jon Moxley's going to be part of that. And of course, after Jon Moxley's first match back, Bryan Danielson does come out. Mox did use Danielson's hammer and anvil elbows in that match. it's kind of like a bit of a wink and a nudge. And I think I'm not sure if it showed it on the YouTube clip that we both watched, but there is a moment where it shows Danielson watching what Jon Moxley's doing right at the end of Jon Moxley's first promo back. So they kind of foreshadowed that without like doing a full interruption, as you suggested, as you mentioned. They didn't do. But yeah, so Danielson comes out and he says that he would love to fight Jon Moxley. And that's one of the people he thought about when he first joined AEW. But instead of having a fight with them, he would prefer for them to fight together. And essentially kind of goes and says that the champs that are around at the moment are soft, which is interesting because he was just coming off losing to Hangman Page before he comes out and does this. So, a few weeks earlier, he'd just lost to Hangman Page in the AEW Championship, but he kind of says they're soft and together that these two could run AEW if they wanted, and they could take the young guys under their wings and sort of shape the future, the next generation of wrestling. And then over the weeks coming afterwards, Moxley sort of says he respects Danielson, but before they could team together, before he would team with anyone, he wants to bleed with them, and that he needed to face Danielson to have the chance to beat Danielson for the first time, because when he was coming into wrestling, Danielson was this mythic figure already who was right up there, and he was just getting started, and he needed to get that win, and he also needs to know that Danielson isn't just trying to avoid him and avoid having that loss to Jon Moxley on his record. What did you think of the promos that they had over the weeks, Mav, and the build to their match?
I thought it was so good. I mean, like I say, what really intrigued me about this was how Danielson was able, having, because obviously AEW had wanted him from the moment it was set up. I mean, I would care to wager. The fact that they got him and the fans got him, and yet he was able to turn himself into a heel. He's getting real boos here. They managed to turn him into a real heel like pretty quickly. And it's the sort of, this is a different version of Bryan Danielson than you've ever seen in WWE. It's kind of very menacing, very cocky.
Yeah, cocky
very
is the
like
word.
Sure of his ability, like basically, even though there was this kind of, Daniel Bryan's the best wrestler in the world type of stuff that would sometimes, happen on WWE TV, because there's this sort of, 40-year relationship with big men, and you had people like Lesnar knocking around. They never really committed to that. And I felt like what was being committed to here is that Bryan Danielson is a scary person to have to wrestle. And, the kind of relaxed arrogance that he kind of shows while he talks to Moxley here is really quite something. And even the way that he sets the question up is like notably villainous, saying to the crowd, like, trying to hype the crowd, do you want to see us fight? He sort of uses lots of flattery. You were different. Look at this. I can see you're the new Jon Moxley. By the way, while I watch from afar, you were the best AEW champion. It's all that classic type of, buttering somebody up, because essentially, like, the only reason to team up with somebody as a heel is because you think it can get you something. And you think it can like support whatever your goals are, right? It's not out of friendship, it's out of convenience. So I thought that was really well done. I also thought the fact that Mox doesn't say anything was again a very bold creative decision, and something which I think the angle works really well, because essentially it's only ever one of them talking at once. Which I thought was really interesting. It's kind of, he listens to the proposal, and then I thought was great as well is that there's foreshadowing for Yuta as well. Like Bryan mentions, like, what if we took this guy under our wing, and it's obviously knowing what happens afterwards, like that's a really cool moment. You know, quite funny as well. He buries Hangman, doesn't he? He buries Luchasaurus. Like, yeah, Bryan's promo here was a different type of Danielson promo that I really appreciated. And Mox look, he does look notably jacked, by the way. I guess this is his first match back, isn't it? He looks like, like he hasn't looked in a long time here.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, not just Yuta. He doesn't just mention Yuta. He also mentions a few people that he's going to have matches with down the line, Lee Moriarty, but then also Daniel Garcia, who will be on the opposing side of the first big story that the Blackpool Combat Club get into, which is against the Jericho Appreciation Society. But I like how you termed what Danielson's kind of attitude is like, with relaxed arrogance, because he's not like up in their face, and he's not rubbing the arrogance in. He's not like rubbing it in everyone's face, but just the cockiness of it is just so evident with what he thinks of these other people. And it really comes off the back of the way he treated the Dark Order in the lead up to the Hangman Page match, and then the way he treated Hangman Page, particularly in their first match, where he was doing star jumps and that sort of thing, and didn't. It kind of all blew up in his face in the end, and they ended up in a draw rather than him being able to press the advantage and get it. But it seems like he hasn't learnt from that. He's still as cocky and as arrogant as he was when he was doing those star jumps, and he still thinks that he's better than Hangman Page, and probably just thinks that if they were to wrestle 10 times, then he would probably win 8, and Hangman just got lucky that he happened to get his 1 out of 10 or one of his 2 out of 10 that in those matches. And yeah, you're right about the sort of the quietness, and it's interesting them doing this angle because Moxley also did an angle with Chris Jericho very early on, where Jericho posed the question of, do you want to join the Inner Circle with me? And that was very blatantly and very clearly there, because it was like, well, Jericho's the champion, and he knows that Jon Moxley is like this caged tiger animal of a wrestler that will rip him limb from limb. And so he's like, well, I'm going to try and team up with you. And it was much more nakedly obvious what was going on. And Jon Moxley, being, a baby face with his head screwed on a little bit, was very alert to that and immediately understood what was going on and decided not to join Jericho and just strung him along so he could steal his vehicle. Yeah, Danielson's a little bit more. He's a little bit more canny in how he approaches Moxley in this instance, particularly. I think, saying we could shape the future generation, because that's something that he knows that Moxley is keen to do, is shape the next generation of wrestlers and have influence on the next generation, and that sort of sets the scene for what Moxley says the week after, where he says, look, I'm keen to, I would be keen to team with you, but before I do that, I need to bleed with you, which is an interesting sort of carryover from his time wrestling in the Shield in WWE. And I was very keen to get your thoughts on this, Mav, because I've got a thesis that, the Dean Ambrose character is really, the Jon Moxley character is really an extension of the Dean Ambrose character. And, there are some differences in the presentation and whatnot, but at its core, at its heart, the character very much continues on from WWE to AEW. And this seems to be a really clear example of that. Like, the way that Jon Moxley, if Jon Moxley's going to team with someone, it needs to be someone who he's shed a bit of blood with. And that's how he builds that mutual respect.
Yeah, I always come back to the initial promos and the build to TLC 12. Like, what was so interesting about, because obviously at this point, Moxley / Ambrose was very much the mic man for the Shield. Like, they had their kind of individual roles. Seth was the one that would sacrifice himself for the benefit of the team. Reigns was the heavy hitter, and Moxley was the kind of evil genius and spokesperson. And I always remember the promo that he gave, where he's like, on Sunday, bring tables, bring ladders, bring chairs. The Shield brings the sword, which is one of his lines that's always stuck with me, because there was this sense with the Shield from the very beginning that they were different to other factions. They weren't teammates, they were brothers. And that's a thread that runs through absolutely everything they do, because even when they hate each other, it's out of love. And you have these amazing moments like the Survivor Series match in 2016, where you have this real sudden moment where Reigns and Ambrose go in to bat for Seth, when Seth is a absolutely hated heel at that point. And it's just that moment that at any point, we could be on the same side again, because we have bled together, because we have been through this business together. The promo before the lumberjack match between Rollins and Ambrose during their epic feud that came out of the Shield's breakup, that they would be fighting over the bodies that they'd left behind during their run of the Shield, like that kind of imagery. And what you get with Danielson here is something similar. Like, if we are going to have that kind of a bond, we need to have fought each other first, because actually, if you go all the way back to FCW, well, Rollins and Ambrose, as he was then, had an epic feud in FCW, which was kind of how I got acquainted with Dean Ambrose in the first place, because I read about his matches with Seth Rollins, his matches with William Regal, and I went and sought them out because they sounded great. And that's when I knew I had my new favourite. And, you got a similar dynamic here. He has to, not only does he have to fight Bryan, he has to beat Bryan, because, of course, what comes out of this eventually is that, in his early wrestling career, they wrestled in Cincinnati, in his hometown, and Bryan came out on top, and it's never left him. And that one of these mental scars is he's never beaten Bryan Danielson in singles competition. Did in the Shield plenty of times as a team, but he's never beaten him in singles competition. So that's something, and it was quite interesting. That I had to go and look it up afterwards, but I wasn't really sure. But it turns out it was true. So yeah, it's a really good basis for the angle, I think.
It's funny how many, like, just talking about these things, who was on the other side of the ring in that TLC match that the Shield debuted in.
Exactly.
Daniel Bryan. And even just you talking, bring up the lumberjack match. Who was one of the lumberjacks in that? Cody Rhodes.
Yeah, yeah. It's and obviously, the other day with the anniversary of the Cody and Goldust versus Rollins and Reigns match, with Dusty and Ambrose on the outside chewing the furniture at each other, So it's I mean, as you know from listening to our show for a long time, the narrative element of it and the long-term story and the connective tissue between characters, what Plan used to call the shared universe, that's what makes wrestling special. If this character interacts with this character, they've had these interactions in the past, and this is what informs what's happening now. And the best pro wrestling has always been based around that. And it's kind of one of those, the greatest things the devil ever pulled is convincing you that isn't what pro wrestling is, because obviously that's kind of what, the worst parts of WWE in the last 20 years have always been about, like trying to make you forget that something else had happened beforehand. And actually what was really great about the reality era in WWE was that suddenly shared universe was absolutely front and center of everything. And what was great about the Cody match, the Cody weekend, I suppose, at WrestleMania, was that everybody that had interacted with him as he tried to finish the story was involved in the denouement of that story. And in fact, like, when the Shield's music played in that match, for one incredibly crazy moment, I thought it was Dean Ambrose. So it just shows you, like, story is the most important thing. And, these two here are creating a story that's going to see them through, the next couple of years of their lives together in AEW. So as a foundational myth, if you like, this is really interesting.
I will say a couple of things about, just a couple further things about it before we get to the match itself. I particularly loved in the Daily's Place promo, just some of the verbiage from Mox, nothing holding up, like nothing like all I drink is blood, but I love the line, I walk through fire, I walk through bullets, I walk through you. He's a man that knows how to drop a one-liner, and he just paints such good pictures with his words. One thing I didn't like, though, I've got to bring this criticism to the fore, was them sort of lining it up and calling it a dream match and promoting it as a dream match, instead of leaning into the story. It just really rankled with me when these guys are trying to tell, it is definitely a marquee match, but it's not. It was at the start of, like, well, AEW has made a lot of, putting on dream matches. In many instances, there has been matches that are worthy of that title. But I don't know, with me, because of what these guys were talking about, because they're talking about, like, their shared history, it just rankled with me. And, it came from both Tony Schiavone and JR, who should know better, really. I wish that sort of the commentary and the production had leaned into the story as much as the two wrestlers were. They didn't talk about it as a dream match. They talked about it as a well, Danielson kind of did, to be fair, at the start, but they talked about they had very different ideas of what they were brewing up when they were doing it. Certainly a marquee matchup, no doubt. This is Jon Moxley, arguably the most promoted wrestler in all of AEW, the most protected wrestler in all of AEW, against Bryan Danielson, who, as you said, is like, one of the crown jewels of the noughties indie scene, and someone who the kind of people that got into AEW very much had as a favorite wrestler for a long time. So I understand where they're coming from, but I don't know, that just rankled with me a little bit.
Yeah, I think, I think JR's got absolutely no business being behind a mic in 2022, never mind in 2024. Obviously, has given everything to the business, and in his prime was, up there. I mean, he'll never be Gorilla Monsoon, but he was certainly up there with some of the best announcers ever in the history of the business. Shivani is a guy funny story. Shivani was the lead commentator of the first wrestling show I ever watched. So the first wrestling voice I ever heard was Tony Schiavone for the 1990 Royal Rumble, which was my gateway into watching wrestling. So he will always be, he was only in WWF for a short period of time, actually. But if you watch the shows on which he was the lead announcer, he was absolutely brilliant, like so good it was really only 1990, I think, and he was so good. So it's not surprising that obviously then he'd be the lead guy in WCW and obviously be involved in some of the more controversial moments that promotion had as it was in its death throes. But again, one criticism of AEW that I think outside voices would have is that they're sometimes too reliant on giants of the industry who are a little past their sell date, in the way that TNA got absolute hell for, and AEW has generally escaped criticism for in a lot of ways. So I do feel like if they could promote from within and find a young commentator who was their voice, I feel like it would be a great benefit to the product, actually. As you say, like the tone of both of them here is a bit discordant with the actual work going on in the promo discussions.
I would say I'd push back on, not for this particular bit, but for me, Shivani coming to AEW has been fantastic. Like, he is someone that was, for all intents and purposes, completely lost to the industry, and him coming back and the enthusiasm and excitement that he brought, I think has been fantastic for the most part. It was just the verbiage and the production of this as a dream match that rankled with me. I agree what you're saying. I think they are. I mean, Excalibur, of course, he was one of the voices of the indies over through the 2010s, and he very much is the voice of AEW. But I think they are slowly bringing in their own people. Nigel McGuinness, he obviously, of course, started commentary in WWE, but has taken a very prominent role in commentary in AEW, and someone who they've been seems to be grooming, and I think is doing a very good job, is Daddy Magic from the 2.0 tag team. He's really good at doing like these screaming to the blood dripping down his face, screaming to a camera promos, and also very good on comms desk. I think they seem to be grooming him to potentially take a large role in the future. So I think that's happening, but I totally understand what you're saying there, Mav, particularly in relation to JR. You know, people can go back. There's been matches where JR has been valuable, but for the most part, and there's some matches where he is actively detracted in ginormous ways and in ways that are very unprofessional. So yeah, I generally agree with you on what you're talking about with JR there. Is there anything further you'd like to say about the build up before we get to the match itself?
I really liked the phrase "dynasty of unmitigated pure wrestling violence," because I from what I've seen, that's exactly what they go on to do. So that was nice as well. And the other thing I thought was really good was the way in which, you know, the sort of the last bits of promo exchange like take place on the back of Danielson, you know, doing this absolutely evil promo where he invokes the spirit of Ring of Honor and the handshake.
Yes.
And then shakes Christopher Daniels' hand and then absolutely like destroys him.
He goes, we used to, in Ring of Honor, because it's straight after Tony Khan's announced that he'd bought Ring of Honor, and to do it, he has Christopher Daniels. I'm not sure if you know this.
I do. Yeah.
So he had Christopher Daniels and Bryan Danielson as two of the members of the first three-way match, that like a match that happened on the first Ring of Honor card. And Danielson goes, in Ring of Honor we used to shake each other's hands afterwards, and he shakes Christopher Daniels, who's on the canvas's hand, and then he says, "But we're not in Ring of Honor," and then he starts stomping his head in. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Tells Moxley that the head that gets stomped in a Revolution will be his as well.
Yeah, indeed.
And then also, I mean, again, like the metaphorical language that Moxley uses is really good, because he says, we're at a crossroads. One crossroads is you kick my head in, the other one is that I walk right through you. So I thought that his story is just beginning, written in blood. So the imagery is all very consistent. And then they square up, and then Danielson bails, which is again the classic heel move. It was nice to see Danielson flexing those kind of heel muscles in that way. Because again, that's not something you often saw in WWE, because he was very much, his heel characters in the ring were very much in the sort of, the chicken shit variety. It was the I'm in a cage match with the Big Show and Mark Henry, so I'm just going to run away for 12 minutes and then scale the cage. So yeah, I thought that the whole build was great. I also thought the hype package for the match was really well done. They had like the footage from Heartland Wrestling that Moxley referenced in the first exchange. They very much and I didn't really sort of get this until that promo video. It was very much SmackDown 6 Angle and Benoit. Like it's the absolute sort of epitome of that frenemies idea. And obviously, like, if you think about like what the SmackDown 6 was and what it represented, basically it was Paul Heyman taking, 6 inverted commas worker wrestlers and, utilizing them to put on the best wrestling show he could, because all the inverted commas marquee assets were on Raw. And obviously, like, he created absolute magic just by creating 3 tag teams out of those wrestlers. And, if you think about what the BCC become, it's all wrestlers who are sort of related to that European slash Japanese slash kind of technical side of American wrestling, and them deciding they were going to run people over together with their mentor. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing that I just noticed from from somebody that's primarily been a sort of Titan Towers watcher over the years. Like that was a comparison that stood out to me.
I'd never thought about that comparison before, but it's a pretty good one, and it's particularly relevant because Tony Khan is unabashedly a fan of ECW. Like, he was a guy who went to the ECW arenas. He's obviously someone who's a fan of Paul Heyman's booking. So he's never mentioned the SmackDown 6, but I don't doubt that he was a fan of the SmackDown 6 when it happened, particularly when you look at how AEW has booked with its, liberal usage of factions and groups to get people over, which is kind of what, as you said, the SmackDown 6 did. It's an immediate way you can give someone an identity is put them in a team, because, by pairing 2 people together, you draw similarities. And that's not one I'd thought of, but it's a good comparison to like Angle and Benoit just being, these straight-eyed, sort of pretty cold, almost cold-hearted, tough guys who will just run you over if you're not careful.
I mean, you're basically saying these are sort of 2 elite, these are sort of 2 elite kind of like you say, cold-eyed workers almost, that will just absolutely just they don't have anything in common other than the fact they both can wrestle each other to a standstill. So if they team up, like, what can happen?
Yep, absolutely. Let's move on to the match. But before we get to it, though, I'd like to quickly plug the amazing new Social Suplex merch line that we've released on Chop Tees. If you haven't seen it yet, I'd love for you to visit Chop Tees and go into the Social Suplex section. Our merch has all been uniquely designed in conjunction with the site to reflect the colourful character of each show on the network. We've got One Nation Radio shirts and hats in the design of the Dream Team, Keeping It Strong Style zip-up combat ready hoodies, Tunnel Talk Snuggies, Imps Adventure teacups, and my personal favourite, my specially designed Match Guide shirt and hoodie, one which I'm actually rocking right now. We created it not just to stand out in the sea of bland wrestling designs, but to commemorate the AEW 5th anniversary Match Guide list we released earlier this year. It's got the show's logo on the front and lists the top 50 AEW matches in the style of an old school band world tour t-shirt on the back. The thing that stood out to me most when I got my shirt, though, was the quality of the garment. We've all had shirts, and particularly wrestling shirts, that stretch or fade after you've only worn and washed them a few times. But these shirts are made from high-quality materials, so they don't just look great, but they last. Chop Tees ship globally at no extra cost, which is great for me, an Australian. They have no tax at checkout, and your first order on the site will be eligible for 10% off. At the Social Suplex, we're all incredibly proud of this collaboration. So don't wait. Head straight to chopped-tees.com/social suplex and get yourself some merch that will not just look great, but will support the network and the people who put together these podcasts every week. That's chopped-tees.com/social suplex. Thanks to Chop Tees for this collaboration. So let's get to the match, and as we always do on the AEW Match Guide, we'll give the match its flowers. So Dave Meltzer rated this match 4.75 stars. Cage Match currently rates it at 8.54. This match didn't actually get any votes on the 5th anniversary definitive match guide list. But when we did it for the best matches in 2022, it came in 16th. So it was a highly rated match at the time, but I would say it potentially isn't as well remembered as some other matches. We might talk more about that later as to why. Of course, it has the fantastic video package that you spoke about, Neil. The one thing that JR does do well is he has a great line to before this all kicks off and before the wrestlers even come in. He said, "This could be a clinic or it could be a bar fight." I love that line. I think it sums up the atmosphere of or what this match could be pretty damn well and succinctly. Danielson's out first. Mox is out second. Schiavone notes that Danielson looks far less cocky than he does against some of the younger wrestlers, which I think is true, even though he still looks pretty sure of himself. But it is an interesting character note, even more sure of himself than he did against Hangman Page. The opening flurry of the match, it sort of pits Danielson's technique against Moxley's greater size and strength. And it's a pretty good way to sort of set up their dynamic. And the crowd immediately gets into it chanting, "We want violence," and "Fuck him up, Moxley, fuck him up." What were your thoughts on the opening flurries, Mav?
I mean, the one thing I will say about Dean Ambrose as compared to Jon Moxley is I don't half miss the Dean Ambrose music. Like, I know the Wild thing, I know people like it and stuff, and it's what I assume what he used in the Indies before he went to WWE, but that Dean Ambrose music, like, you just knew business had picked up when you heard it. Like, you'd get the screech of the tires, and then the guitar riff would come in and he'd start marching out, and it just used to get me every time. So yeah, not quite that was the one bit I was like, oh, you know what, I really missed that. But like, I think the scientific start was really nice. It's an underrated part of Mox's game. I always think one of his best matches in WWE was the AJ Styles one from like September 2016. I thought that was
Backlash.
Yes, and that was a really, really underrated match. And it was one of those things where at the time when people were rating matches, they were always rating them about how many moves there were in them. And because it was AJ Styles, people expected it to be, lots of flying around all over the place. And they wrestled like a real new generation style, sensible match with AJ Styles in the kind of Shawn Michaels role. I mean, not 90s Shawn Michaels, not like, annoying Shawn Michaels. And Dean Ambrose in the kind of in the Bret Hart role, and they just had this fantastic match, which was much more scientific than I think people would expect from a Dean Ambrose match, because obviously people peg him as a brawler, and really he isn't. Like there are times when he's sort of, well, his WWE character, like, it was pitched as him, he would sometimes like go lunatic or have this lunatic flurry where he would just wail on somebody, but it's not like he wasn't purely a brawler. He was also a technical wrestler, and that's what you kind of get here. 97 Austin's another, 96 or 97 Austin's another comparison that I give here. It's like before his neck injury, you had somebody that could brawl, but also just beforehand had been the ringmaster, and he was called the ringmaster because he knew all the wrestling holds. So yeah, I think that's a nice way to remind people that Bryan's not going to out wrestle him necessarily. Like, if Bryan wants to take things to the mat, then Moxley can live with it, because obviously, like, Moxley has several submissions of his own that he's used over the years. So that's a good way to start it, and then it kind of transitions out of that because Moxley slaps him.
Yeah, they really start playing ego games quite a bit. I think after that slap, they're both sort of putting their hands behind their back, chin out. Danielson lets Mox, kick him, which is an interesting setup given, what they've talked about in the lead up, how they both have quite a bit of respect, but they both want to see themselves as being above the other, and they're really sort of playing games of one-upsmanship after that early grappling.
Yeah, definitely. I think stealing the yes kicks, I don't know if he still calls them those actually, but stealing the yes kicks and Bryan then reversing it and doing the same. They both try they both sort of try Bryan tries a guillotine, doesn't he? And then Mox counts into a kind of rest hold of his own, and it's only then that it kind of spills to the outside. And I quite like, I think it was JR called it hockey fighting.
Before we get to that, one thing I'd note though is I'd say it gets beyond those ego games a little bit, where Danielson kicks Mox in sort of the liver area, in the ribs liver area, and that's when Mox starts to crack a little and starts to like really sell. And I thought that was interesting, given that we know that Moxley, of course, is a recovered alcoholic, and that, you know, targeting his liver it's almost a little bit of a shot from Danielson. We talked about how he's a bit cocky. Like, it didn't get brought up explicitly in the any of the build up or anything, but we know, like, Danielson is known for living a very clean life. At times he's been a vegan, and him, you know, sort of kicking Mox in the kidney/liver area when he's, you know, been someone who's abused that part of his body a little bit is an interesting one. And from then on, Moxley does sell his ribs and liver and that midsection quite a bit, you know, gritting his teeth. And Danielson does target the rib cage a little bit. I thought that was an interesting little wrinkle to their sort of, you know, mutual respect frenemies thing that they've got going on.
Yeah, it gets nasty, doesn't it? Like, it starts out respectful, but it gets nastier. I hadn't sort of made the metaphorical connection to, you know, to the kind of the rehab that he'd just done, but I do like that. That's an interesting little interpretation to look at it, because obviously, like, they're playing these mind games, and that's always going to turn nasty, and then that becomes, you know, the outright brawling that's kind of much more down Mox's alley. So they kind of do the Danielson specialism at the beginning, and then they do the Moxley specialism. And it's, you know, and again, like, if you think back to, you know, Bret Hart v Stone Cold, like, it's a submission match. Like, Stone Cold doesn't have a submission apart from the $1 Million Dream, you know. But it's like, you know, you can make the other person's specialism your specialism. I mean, that's always like a two can play at that game type of dynamic. I think always works well in wrestling.
Absolutely.
And I also like the fact that what supposedly Mox's specialism actually falls like not in his favor, because he, you know, like, it leads to him sort of getting busted open. And so it's like he's gone in for his, you know, what's his bread and butter, but Danielson comes out of that better.
Yeah, as you said, they sort of spill to the outside and then start hockey fighting. Really, they're really going at each other as well, and they clash heads, and that opens Moxley up. I've got to ask, Mav, because, you know, you were writing about WWE all through the 2010s. Of course, that's a time where bleeding is, you know, maybe a once every couple of years thing, very rare, and never blading either. It's something that they would, you know, would happen unintentionally, or that on the very odd occasion they would go hard way. What are your thoughts on the bleeding in wrestling generally, and then, you know, bleeding in AEW, and specifically Moxley's penchant for bleeding in wrestling?
I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that in the right circumstances, blading is, I would say, like, an essential part of certain types of wrestling match where you need a certain type of drama. I think, you know, particularly if you think about that iconic image of Austin locked in the sharpshooter passing out, like, that match does not go over in the same way. I mean, obviously the legendary story is that Austin had never bladed before, and Brett did it for him. I don't know if you've ever heard that one before, but yeah, that was like Austin had never done it before, so Brett did it. It's in Brett's autobiography. So like, I do think it's an essential part of certain types of match. WWE in the later period of the Attitude Era, and certainly into that first part of Ruthless Aggression, massively overused it. To the point of ridiculousness, I think. And then, of course, like, you know, post Eddie and post Benoit, I think very understandably they stepped back from it, and then it became, you know, almost too bland. I mean, it's I can see all the arguments in different from the different points of view. Like in a world of hepatitis and HIV, like it's not great. But if you're going to do it, I think blading is a lot better idea than hard way. I weirdly accidentally came across that awful moment in that SummerSlam from I think it was SummerSlam 18 where Lesnar elbowed Orton repeatedly, and it was one of the most uncomfortable things I think I've ever watched in a wrestling ring. It was like, and supposedly everybody backstage was like disgusted by it. So
Jericho reckons he tried to fight Brock Lesnar over it, if you believe him.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like Jericho, the last true carny, isn't he? Like he'll say anything. Yeah, that guy's just carny as hell, isn't he? I think I can see all the arguments on all sides. From what I've seen, I'd probably suggest that AEW's overused it a little. Again, like I say that from a position of seeing a clip or a screenshot of somebody busted open like fairly frequently. So I mean, obviously, if you're watching 3 shows a week plus a pay-per-view every 6 weeks, like maybe it doesn't seem that much over that span of time, but it seems to happen more often than I would expect it to, given that it should be something that's reserved for the most dramatic or the most bitter of circumstances. Like from what I know about Hangman and Swerve, like absolutely it would fit there. But if it's just a title match and it's like there's not a stip or anything, it's just a one-on-one title match, I find it hard to believe an argument that says that blood's relevant there. So I think it's really powerful tool, but it's, as with any powerful tools, it's only powerful if you use it sparingly.
Yeah. Look, I think what you've said there is completely fair. There was probably a time, and look, I think Moxley probably deal with it later in 2022, to be honest, of like overusing it. And I would say that 2024, they've really have got the balance right. It does seem to have been saved a lot more. And I think there must have been something that happened backstage where they've been given a directive that it's not something they're going to do all the time. And I think they have mostly, for the most part, used it in big events, like in big moments, to specifically like get a feud over in the lead up to a feud, in the lead up to a match, or to get an angle over, or in a match, like in a big time match, like as you said, the Hangman versus Swerve. Of course, that's going to need it. That is the quintessential blood feud, and so it makes sense that that's what would happen in there. And it's been interesting to see that slowly coming back into the WWE as well this year, with particularly the most prominent one early in the year was The Rock. Cutting Cody Rhodes, who was someone that back in 2020 was getting criticized for it in AEW, but used it to great effect. Used it to great effect in the build up to their match, and to shocking effect as well, because it was like, whoa, hold on, we haven't seen this for a while. And then of course, it seems like Punk and McIntyre did it the hard way with the toolbox in Hell in a Cell, but certainly they leaned into having blood as part of that match. So, yeah, I totally agree with what you've said there, and I think it works very well in this match as well. Like Moxley has blood coming all the way down his face, and it seems like Danielson cuts him, like is bleeding as well, although it's not 100% clear if it's his blood or Moxley's blood that's just got on him, but there's blood everywhere, and it adds to the ethos of the match, particularly when you look at what they were talking about in the lead up to the match, of what they're going to be doing to each other. And as you said, this match it kind of does turn a bit nasty, and it makes sense that as they're brawling, that it is the kind of thing that could lead to someone being busted open. One thing I really like, once they come back in, it's a really slow paced match for AEW standards, I think. But the struggle in it between them seems very real. Like they're always fighting for position and pushing. There always seems to be a lot of weight behind everything they're doing. One thing in particular I liked that I haven't seen too many people do and was really effective was they both had a Muay Thai clinch on. So the Muay Thai plum, and they were both delivering knees to each other, and it had a real weight to it and a real struggle to it that I've rarely seen in any wrestling, particularly in AEW, where sometimes it does tend to be a lot more fast paced. And I really liked that. And then the Dragon Sleeper as well that Danielson locks in looks really gruesome. He really is like wrenching Moxley's body around when it's in that Dragon Sleeper.
Have you ever seen Bret Hart v Bulldog from Season's Beatings?
I don't believe so, no.
It would have been December 95, I think it would have been. Okay, you have to watch that match, but B, it really reminds me of that match. Basically, it's like a really, really, especially for 1995, like a really vicious title match. It's the sort of, it's like the Empire Strikes Back to the SummerSlam matches, like New Hope. It's really really gritty match, and Bulldog like bleeds all over the place. It's a crazy match.
It does sound like the kind of match I'd like if you've described it that way.
Oh, it's honestly, I mean, it's one of those like real overlooked gems because it happened on an In Your House. Like, people don't talk about it, but it's absolutely brilliant. So I think the
hipster pick, if you will.
The reason I like this match so much is because it makes such good sense in a way that lots of modern wrestling to me doesn't make very good sense. It's like, it's two people who are, wary of each other. So they're not going to like rush in and, expose themselves. So, it becomes a bit of a dance for an advantage. And they really play up to, I think, the fact that Moxley hasn't wrestled somebody of Bryan's standard since he's been back, because I assume the people he was fighting on TV would have been, lower mid-card guys.
Yep, 100%.
So he hasn't taken on anybody like Danielson in a while. It's also a bit of a white whale for him, like he's never beaten Danielson. So they're not going to approach this, in a non-cautious way because Danielson knows that Mox is dangerous, so he's not going to overexpose himself either. And what's really interesting is when Danielson gets the advantage, it's because Moxley takes the risk of a superplex, and then that's when you get this sort of MMA style sequence with the elbows and the Dragon Sleeper and the the kind of bit with the reversals of the sleeper holds back and forth, and they kind of roll all over the ring, and the blood's getting all over the mat. And it just makes sense because it's supposed to be a match where they're both in the trenches. Mox has been metaphorically in the trenches fighting his demons. Danielson has fought his own demons to even have a pro wrestling career. I mean, for somebody of his size to have had a mainstream wrestling career is a demon slaying all of its own. Not to mention his injury issues, the fact that, the prejudice issues he faced to get to where he did in WWE, despite the size disadvantage, despite the political disadvantage, to be the most over person in the industry and yet still have to have a last minute change of plans to get him there. All of those things mean that when these two face each other, it's going to be a sort of down and dirty in the trenches war. It's not going to be a fast-paced, slick, counter after counter. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be a slugfest. It's going to be a kind of mat wrestling affair. It's quite interesting. Like, neither of them leave their feet very often in this match. If you watch it, I think there's one bit where Danielson hits his knee finisher at one point, and Moxley hits that superplex. Other than that, I don't think they leave their feet.
Danielson does a tope at one point.
Yes, that's right. But yeah, it's a very mat-based wrestling match, which makes sense in the context of it, because obviously what they're building towards is the ultimate mat wrestler coming out and telling them to behave themselves. So, like, of course, this is the kind of match that they're having.
Yeah, it sort of really, to me, it sort of summed up in like almost the entire ethos of the match is after you kind of mentioned those submissions, they're going back and forth. It's like dragon screw, then Moxley gets it to an armbar, and then Danielson turns it to a label lock, and then they end up in with each other's wrists on the ground, simultaneously just kicking each other in the face. And it's like, let's, who can grit through this pain and deliver it out more than the other guy, and who can grit their teeth and take it and still deal it out. And yeah, you're right. Like, in the trenches is a great way to put it. It's such a gritty match.
Yeah, and I think, right, there's a place for, absolutely there's a place for high-flying wrestling, for fast-paced wrestling. Like, my first favorite tag team was the Rockers, right? I like a flippy dippy wrestler as much as the next person, but also I think what the new generation sort of teaches us is that great all-rounders are what wrestling is built around. That's why your Kurt Hennig's, your Bret Hart's, your 90s version of Shawn Michaels, which I stressed that. I stressed the 90s version. Your Sean Waltmans. I'd even chuck Triple H in there, actually. The pre-quad Triple H. Like, people that are just great all-rounders and can do a bit of everything. That's what you build your company around. And you see that here. Like, you wouldn't have said that Dean Ambrose was a wrestler, bar the odd sleeper hold, that particularly was like a MMA influenced grappler. But here you see him exchanging those holds with Bryan incredibly naturally, which again plays into that psychological, I'm going to play your game better than you can, which again is a theme that always works well in effective pro wrestling. It's a classic it's a classic idea. It's the I'll beat you with your own finishing move, like, these kind of mind games. And again, like, I'd come back to the Angle Benoit comparison. If you go back to that classic Royal Rumble match that they had in 2003, that's kind of what's happening. Is they're sort of Benoit's got the ankle lock in, Angle's got the crossface in. It's that sort of thing.
The final movement of the match is very much that sort of thing. Danielson hits his Busaiku knee. He puts Mox in a triangle choke. He sort of showboats a little bit doing the double biceps while he's got Mox in the choke. But then he realizes he's not just going to be able to choke Mox out. So he starts like trying to punch him. There's just blood all over everyone. Moxley's bleeding all over Danielson. It's quite the visual. But as Danielson's trying to punch Moxley out, Mox manages to get his feet under him and rolls over, pins Danielson to the mat, and gets the 3 count for the win. Danielson is not happy about it. He gets in the ref Rice Remberg's face before he kicks Mox, and the pair just start brawling again. The refs all run out. They can't separate it. And then, of course, as you sort of said, Mav, William Regal makes his surprise entrance to the promotion. He separates the two of them. He looks at them before he just absolutely slaps the taste out of each man's, and then he makes them shake hands, and they all walk off together to form the Blackpool Combat Club. What did you think of the ending of the match, Mav?
I loved it. I think the sudden pace increase that you get just before the knee is a really nice touch. That bit of light and shade, if you like. I love the fact that the only near fall in the match is there. That's it. Yep. There's not another near fall in the whole thing. Again, anyone that's ever been a regular reader or listener knows that I hate near falls, particularly matches that are just literally near fall after near fall, nothing else. So I think that's really good. Again, it's this match is very old school. It appeals to me because it's a very old school match. It's a match that could have taken place in 1993, 1994, like and would have been not out of place at all. The finish is great because again, it's such a classic thing. It's the Survivor Series 96 finish. Not, obviously not using the turnbuckle. Survivor Series 96 or the Hart and Piper match from WrestleMania 8. Like, it's a classic. Someone's got a submission in and you pin them. Like, brilliant. Like, I love it. The punches nowadays that Bryan was raining down, by the way, are absolutely killer. Again, Bryan never really got to be a shooter in WWE in that way. Like, he kind of was, but because he was a face for such long periods of time, like I don't know, he was almost more of a high flyer at times than he was a pure killer. Do you know what I mean?
A gritty technical killer isn't really a character that a top level WWE person did at that point, like really at all in the 2010s.
No, I mean, Angle as the wrestling machine would have been the last one, I guess. So yeah, it's something he never really got to do. So that's again,
that's not something really Vince McMahon was into at all, really. I think.
No, I mean, I guess there were flirtations with it. Obviously, Benoit won a world title, and Angle certainly towards the end of Angle's time when he stopped. They took all the goofiness out of his character for that last run, didn't they? And they just had him be a cold-eyed kind of, the guy with the black gum shield. And that was, it's funny. I think Plan always said that was his favourite version of Angle. So yeah, it was really cool to see that actually. And it was good to see the fact that, this is something that you should be afraid of. Like, that's a nice way for him to be integrated into the company, I think. Because the whole point of signing a Bryan, if you're going to sign somebody like that, you better have a plan for them. Because often you sign these veterans and they just do the stuff they've always done. Whereas actually with Bryan, it does seem like they had a genuine plan that he would help to elevate people. And if he's going to do that, he's got to be someone that's genuinely, forgive the pun, a dragon to be slain. So yeah, thought that was great. And then obviously, I mean, I was always going to love the Regal stuff because essentially, again, going back historically, it's Brett running into the ring to stop Owen and Bulldog fighting in March 97 and forming the New Heart Foundation. So that's essentially the historical inspiration for that, which again comes off really, really well. And it's cool as well because, as I say, my first exposure to Dean Ambrose / Jon Moxley was watching him wrestle William Regal in NXT or the FCW, actually. No, FCW. So yeah, that was a nice point of circularity to me. And also the demeanor of Regal as he does that, like, he looks so severe and so commanding. It is literally like, Dad's here.
Yep.
Like, Dad's turned up and he's like not happy to find his son like brawling. The other thing which I thought was really funny, and it was the one like real funny quotable JR line in this whole match, I thought, was when he said about the ref and Danielson, both of these people could be more professional. Like, I laughed out loud at that because it was kind of like he was going in on the ref as well as Danielson.
JR goes in on the refs a lot in AEW also.
Yeah, I thought that was really good.
There's a lot to say
like,
about the refs.
For a period of time, like, you weren't allowed to say the name of the ref in WWE towards the end of Vince's time, like, which was always ridiculous because obviously back in the day, like, poor old Mike Chioda and Earl Hebner and, all the rest of them were always Jack Doan. All these guys were always, getting knocked out in spurious ref bumps and, getting blindsided and all this sort of stuff and getting involved in angles. So yeah, like, it's good to see like stuff refs actually be a part of the furniture, a moving part of the arrangement, because if they're just there to count, and what's that Matt Hardy line from the that ridiculous thing that him and Jeff did in TNA? It was like, you are only here to count the 3 or the submission. I always remember that. But yeah, if they're just there to do that, like, there's not a lot of point. Like, you might as well just have like a electronic scoreboard or something. Like the ref is there as part of the match, so I was pleased to kind of see that bit of interaction at the end.
You reckon bring VAR into pro wrestling, hey?
Oh, do you know what's happened? Do you remember that Undertaker? Was it Undertaker? Was it Undertaker Lesnar? There was something where they kept looking at the replay of where the shoulder was down. I'd have to remember which. I
don't remember what you're talking about, but
there's
a
very prominent match where they did actually spend a load of time looking at the video footage for when the shoulder came up. I think it's the only time they did it, but it was very funny.
Yeah, one of the things I like about obviously I like many things about AEW, but it was interesting to see all of the refs have got their own little personality. They've never done like a storyline about it, but if you follow AEW closely enough, you'll see like the referees all have their own little personalities and their own little idiosyncrasies in the ring, which is, it is a nice thing to see. If you're a fan, you just like those little details. A couple of things at this ending, though, with the match kind of, to me, drew comparisons to. So I'm not sure if you've seen it, but Danielson and Omega had a 30-minute draw. It was Danielson's first match in AEW. Was probably about 6 months before this match happens. And the bell rings and finishes, and they just keep fighting. Like, both of them are so lost in the moment of fighting and just want to continue going. They don't care that the bell's gone. And I like that sort of that like vibe continued on. This match is finished, but the fight's not over for Danielson. He just wants to keep going, and he just wants to keep going at it with Moxley. And I also thought it was interesting, Danielson's sort of in the lead at the end of this match, but he doesn't get the win. He almost squanders it, like when he locks in that choke, he does the double biceps. He doesn't immediately like squeeze that head down to try and get the win. And it's something that's similar that happened to Danielson in his hour-long draw with Hangman, which was, about 2 months before this match. He is very much in the lead. He's got Hangman on the ropes, but instead of pushing the advantage, he sort of showboats a little bit and he squanders that lead. It ends up costing him. They end up drawn. He can't scramble and get the win in the end. And then when they have the rematch, he gets beaten by Hangman Page. So yeah, it was interesting to see both of those things sort of showing up at the end of this match as well. And of course, you're right to call out the history with Regal. Mox and Regal had a fantastic feud in FCW where like Moxley just could not, after he lost to Regal, he just could not get Regal out of his head, and then he ends up just like brutally beating up Regal in a match that doesn't even have like a finish, like a 3-count finish. He just beats him up too much, and I love how in it like Regal first goes to Mox and he gives Mox a bit of a headbutt as well, and Danielson. It is very much like his two kids, because Danielson starts laughing at him like, look what Daddy just did to you. And Regal just comes over and slaps him too. He's like, this isn't a game, which I really like that little, little character contrast between the two of them when Regal shows up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of love that. I love that sort of, JR kind of says on commentary, like, he's been a mentor, something of a mentor to these two guys, and it's as if nobody knew.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a particularly, you just think like an AEW audience, like, of course they're going to know all the history of everything that's ever happened with any wrestler ever. Like, I don't think you need to lampshade it quite that much. Yeah. But I thought the entire thing was so effective, because not only was it in and of itself a great match, but it served a purpose. It creates a faction, it creates an interaction between, a manager and, and the stable that they're about to build, and it gives the whole thing like a much like greater purpose. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic match. I mean, did you say it was voted 16th best match? If there are 15 matches better than this, then I'd be very surprised.
For 2022, so I've done the definitive match guide list a few times. The first time I did it was for AEW's first 2 years in operation. Then a year later, which was so Double or Nothing 2021 through to Double or Nothing 2022. This match came in 16th in that list. So unfortunately, the web host you've got to go to the Wayback Machine to find that, as you do for all of the work that we put onto Lords of Pain / Now Wrestling headlines. I'll send you a screenshot of my Excel spreadsheet though afterwards. I don't think you'll agree with it though, just knowing your tastes in wrestling.
It's interesting. Like everyone's got their own way of looking at things, but I mean, to me, no matter what your taste in wrestling might be, if this isn't one of the top 5 matches in the promotion in 2022, I'd be really surprised. It almost makes me curious enough to, go and watch a bunch of the others, because to me though, this, I mean, obviously you select this match like with me in mind, not only because the fact that it's 2 guys that I'd followed closely beforehand and would have, prior expectations of, but also because, this is a very mid-90s WWF match. And I don't know, like I may get people screaming in your comment section about that comment, but, I would say to, big fans of AEW that do like this style of match, well, Monday Night Raw 1993 to about 1997 is your program. Go and watch some. Like you will have a great time with that. Like I promise you, as you will with lots of the pay-per-view matches. New Generation gets a sort of very bizarre characterization of being like wrestling dustmen and hockey players and nothing else, but it really isn't that at all. But so naturally I was going to like this match a lot. To me, it sums up everything that I would look for in a pro wrestling match. It's story based. It has a purpose. It's believable. It's not just full of moves for the sake of moves. It doesn't overuse near falls. The performers are completely committed to it. Everything is in character. It was built intelligently. It's not too like grandiose or bombastic. Stuff like that can be quite off-putting. So to me, it's a great modern version of the wrestling that I grew up watching. And for that reason, like I'd rate it very, very highly.
Yeah, it's interesting that this match isn't as well remembered as it came, as you said, it came in 16th on that 2022 list. So AEW's 3rd year in existence. It came in 16th, and it didn't get a single vote when I did the top 50 matches the top. I just let anyone vote, and then I narrowed it down to top 50. Like 80 something matches got votes, and this didn't get a single vote in that for the first 5 years of AEW's existence. And it's curious as to why, because coming back to this match, I maybe hadn't watched it for quite a while, and it's it's very good in what it does, but it isn't. I think part of it is both wrestlers have had like such high profile matches outside of this. Like even, just before, if you think Bryan Danielson in early 2022, what I think most people would jump to is Hangman Page. The 2 matches he had with Hangman Page for firstly the draw and then the rematch that they had. And I'd say that's probably the ones that immediately come to mind. And then later on, these guys would go on and, as part of the Blackpool Combat Club, Jon Moxley would have that incredible match with Wheeler Yuta, which happens, within a few months of this one happening. And then they would have, some big, really violent multi-man matches with the Jericho Appreciation Society, which were also, very prominent. And this one sort of, I think it just gets forgotten about in some ways because it's wedged in between those more high profile matches and this is kind of just like, this is the starting point for the Blackpool Combat Club. And that's what I guess people remember it for, which is, as you've said, Maverick, it almost does this match a disservice because by itself and as a standalone entity, it's really quite compelling in some of the things it does. It was really enjoyable to go back and watch this over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's really cool about doing this. I mean, I hope we bring it back to prominence, and I hope we encourage people to give it another watch for one thing. But it's certainly, I mean, I guess the thing is, like, I haven't sort of watched wrestling with a kind of critical hat on or a critical eye. I did a lot of research when we did that 10 years of the Shield podcast. I did a lot of research for that. So probably been a good 13 or 14 months since I've kind of watched wrestling with that kind of real critical lens, as opposed to just watching it to enjoy it. And what's really cool about that is it makes me think, well, you know what, if there are matches like that exist in AEW, it makes me want to watch some more, right? So I finished watching this and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll pay the £6 or whatever and I'll go and watch the rest of BCC stuff, because if that's the kind of output that they were putting out, I'm interested to see more, definitely. Because certainly, like, whenever I've seen him, I've said this to you in private before as well, like, Wheeler Yuta is a guy who I just think has got like limitless potential. Like, I just think he's absolutely fantastic, and I love this quasi-son relationship he has with both Danielson and Moxley. Like, it's a really fun dynamic, I think. So yeah, definitely, if you want a kind of, I guess, a gateway drug for me into AEW, I think you chose a very good match.
I did intend it for that, and I'm probably going to break your heart a little bit in a moment, Maverick, because one of the things I wanted to talk about after this is, like, this is a great starting point for the BCC, but I think looking at the BCC, and we can definitely put a bow on the first act of it, because now Danielson has had his retirement match and he was retired by Jon Moxley. I think for me, the BCC didn't live up to what I originally envisaged from it. They sort of ended up flittering a little bit. They never committed long term to whether they're face or heel, which I think is part of the problem. Like, straight after this, like, you're getting very excited about this Danielson character, but straight after it, they go into a program with the Jericho Appreciation Society, who are the sports entertainers of wrestling of AEW, and Jericho says he's bringing sports entertainment to AEW. And
like I say, the last true carny.
Yeah, and of course these these hardened bastards, Jon Moxley's seen sports entertainment before and didn't like the face of it. So they have a very violent feud, but they're very much the faces in it. But then later on, straight afterwards, they'll turn heel later on, and then they'll, at different points they'll splinter off, and Danielson will be a face while the rest of the group is being a heel. There's some really good stuff, don't get me wrong, like sandwiched amongst it all, but the actual Blackpool Combat Club, I don't think what I envisaged was almost like, have you ever seen the show Cobra Kai?
Yeah.
I kind of envisage, particularly you'll see if you do end up exploring more, Garcia becomes a big part of it as well. He joins Jericho's faction, and Garcia very much idolizes Danielson, and him and Danielson have a number of matches later on in 2022, and I sort of envisaged more within the faction of like interfaction battling of like with Yuta and Garcia, alignments shifting more, but it never kind of happened that way. Look, to be honest, you really love Wheeler Yuta. It really hasn't clicked for him. He's had some good matches, but he really hasn't developed and improved his position in the card beyond when he initially joined the Blackpool Combat Club, which has been part of one of the criticisms of AEW, is like this stagnation that's happened in the mid card as
They sign more and more
as the rosters bloated more and more, which is sad because like you can see with Wheeler Yuta when him and Jon Moxley have this match later on, it starts out actually there's a tag match. So at the moment Wheeler Yuta, when this is happening, Wheeler Yuta is aligned with the Best Friends, who are very much like AEW mascot. They hug each other in their matches. I'm not sure how much you've seen of the Best Friends.
I've seen a couple of their matches actually.
Yeah,
it was like on a couple of pay-per-views that I saw.
Yeah, and so Yuta's aligned with them, and they're like very happy-go-lucky, in contrast to these hard bastards, the Blackpool Combat Club. And Moxley and Danielson have a tag match with them, and that's where Yuta gets in their sights. And then Danielson has a match with Yuta and beats him, and then Yuta's kind of conflicted after that. And then you have that brilliant Jon Moxley Wheeler Yuta match, where Yuta ultimately ends up joining the BCC. And so you get a bit of that at the start, but then it never really clicks beyond that, unfortunately. And Yuta showed a lot of promise in those moments, and at times he's had a little bit of feature, but unfortunately he hasn't really progressed that far up the card, and even character-wise hasn't progressed. Although in this recent 2024, fast forward to 2024, it's late October, it does look like there's a little bit more happening with his character since the Moxley Danielson stuff went down. Yeah, ultimately sided with Moxley at this point, but seems a little bit conflicted by it all.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's that. To be honest, do you remember? I don't know if you ever saw much of the Radicals, because what you're describing sounds a bit like the Radicals in WWE. WF actually as it would have been at the time. But when Eddie, Benoit, Perry Saturn, and Dean Malenko all crossed over from WCW, they were a faction. And at the beginning, they have this sort of this sort of match with DX. What's left of DX, I suppose, by this point. And that's what sort of establishes them. They kind of They basically sit in the crowd of Raw as basically free agents, and then essentially they keep kind of getting involved and stuff and interfere, and they basically have a match to win a contract essentially. And then obviously Benoit straight away is in contention for the Intercontinental title, and he him and Jericho and Angle have a kind of three-way feud leading into sort of WrestleMania 2000s, and then
I've watched those matches without knowing the context around them,
and then it splinters off into the famous Intercontinental feud with Benoit and Jericho, which is absolutely fantastic. But Benoit at this point is so far above the rest of the Radicals in terms of card position that the other three just kind of got left not doing an awful lot. And then kind of the summer of 2000, Eddie's off with China, and he's kind of like a quasi face because he's China's boyfriend. And, Malenko and Saturn are just kind of, not doing a great deal. Like Malenko's the light heavyweight champion, but it doesn't get defended an awful lot. And you have lots of different tag matches and things. But, there are times when they all come back together and it's really interesting. And there are times when they actually end up in fatal four ways and stuff, where there's a fatal four way at No Way Out 2001 where actually Benoit and Eddie are in the same fatal four way and start off trying to cooperate and then ends up fighting each other as well. So yeah, it sounds a little bit like that, where it's like that faction had huge potential, but because they were ex-WCW, they never quite got pushed as that after their initial little bit of momentum, and Benoit became more of its own thing. So yeah, there's a little bit of similarity there, where they're a faction, but it's a bit bitty. Yeah.
Look, it's for me, it's interesting because I'm thinking now of all these incredible things that happen. So, in a year on from this, Moxley and Hangman Page have one of my favorite feuds in all of AEW, in the history of AEW. They have an incredible, and then that sort of dovetails into this feud where Hangman Page joins back up with the Elite, and the Elite and Blackpool Combat Club end up having a feud against one another. And that's when the BCC are heels and the Elite are the faces at the time. But look, it's funny because, and as I said, like the Danielson's matches with Garcia are quite good, but it wasn't what I was hoping it would be, I guess. And
yeah,
I think
that's always the thing in wrestling, isn't it?
Yeah, and one thing I recently reflected on is like how much wrestling criticism is just fantasy booking, and how much of it is actually just critiquing what happened. And so I'm trying not to like be too married to that, but I think there was more potential with the character drama that could have come out of the BCC than what they ended up doing. And it's kind of what they kind of put off having any matches against one another within the team until now what's happened in, where it's all exploded in 2024. So I don't know, maybe there'll be potential for that more down the line, and we'll see, something with Claudio and Moxley potentially kicking off. I can imagine when Eddie Kingston comes back, he's got a sordid history with Claudio Castagnoli, and was very good friends with Jon Moxley at one point. What he will think of what's happened, and sort of also made amends with Bryan Danielson. So he'll be an interesting factor to sort of come into the 2024 feud. And yeah, Wheeler Yuta is poised to do something interesting. He's still very young, so there's still plenty of time for him to forge his path and make good on that potential that I think both of us see in him. So yeah, look, I don't have a whole lot more to say about the match, but I do thank you for your time, Mav. Is there anything else you'd like to speak about with the feud or anything we've talked about today?
Well, I mean, thank you for having me on first and foremost. Yep. It's been a pleasure. It's always nice to talk wrestling with you. Yeah, I think I'm finding the promos that Moxley's cutting at the moment really interesting. Like, they're obviously very easy to sort of, just randomly come across on Twitter. And, since he came back, I've watched most of those promos, and I find the character that he's developing at the moment really, really intriguing. I think I said to you, like, it almost reminds me of beginning of the Shield Moxley, the sort of, the almost trolling nature, like, the kind of the version of him that was saying nope to Michael Cole and things like that. Like,
yep.
It kind of gave me those vibes. So yeah, I'm definitely interested to see where that goes.
Yep. Well, I will. Maybe we'll check in a year's time or so. If I'm still doing this podcast, I can bring you on and we can talk about maybe the second match that Moxley. Well, actually, Moxley and Danielson had a few matches, but the most recent match with Moxley and Danielson. And review what's happened with the BCC since.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Good.
Excellent. But look, normally at this point, I'd ask you to plug where people can find you, but you're a pretty difficult person to find on any social media. You want to put anything out there for the listeners to jump into?
Well, context wise, in my real life, I'm an assistant principal in a school. So yeah, so for that reason, I have to have all my socials on private because of those pesky children. But you can grab me on Twitter. I can't remember whether it's Maverick LOP or LOP Maverick. Actually, I'm literally going to have to quit.
I'll put the link in the description.
Maverick _ Maverick _ LOP. There you go. You'll be able to find me, and I do sometimes talk wrestling still on there. You can listen to the comeback episodes of The Right Side of the Ponds, should you wish to. If you just Google The Right Side of the Ponds, you'll find all the, I think, 5 or 6 episodes that we've done since we've just been part-time doing it as an occasional thing. You should be able to find it. So Right Side of the Pond Wrestling Podcast, and you should be able to find those. So there's 2 episodes of WrestleMania. There's an episode on 10 years of the Shield. There's an episode about the build to WrestleMania, and maybe there's even one more that I've forgotten about. But yeah, you can certainly listen to those there, should you wish to.
Old ones floating out there as well, if you want to look hard enough and search long enough. But
yeah,
if
anyone is absolutely desperate for a classic episode of Portland, I do have most of them as
really want some. Really want some old LOP radio. Mav, it's been really fun having you on. I'm really glad we got to do this. I've sort of wondered if or when I would have you guys on, next step, I guess, will be to bring Plan or Mazza on, which I think will be a little bit more of a tall order than getting you on. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I'll put a word in for you.
Look, I do very much appreciate you coming on and spending the time with us today. And thank you also to the listeners out there. Thank you for listening in. Thanks for sticking with us. It's been great to have you along with us today. If you did like what you hear, we would love it if you could rate and review us. That goes a long way to getting our name out there and helping people find us. Give us the big 5 stars on whatever podcast app you're listening on. As I said at the top as well, you can join in the Social Suplex Discord. You can jump into that. There's a link in the description. On the Discord, we've got channels for all different types of wrestling, all different promotions where you can discuss it. It's almost like one of the old forums of old, Mav. You might want to jump on yourself. And then there's also channels for each of the shows that we've got here on Social Suplex. If you want to jump in there, let me know what you thought of this match. And let me know what you thought of the analysis. And if you want, you can also recommend a match and suggest a match for me to cover on the podcast in that channel. It's a great way to have a chat about wrestling, but away from, some of the more toxic elements of public social media, if that's how you're feeling in 2024 about talking about wrestling online. And of course, to support the podcast, we would love it if you went to chopped-tees.com/social suplex. Get your merch. We've got merch for all of the shows, and especially my merch, the AEW Match Guide merch. I'm incredibly proud of it. I'm wearing it at the moment. It's very comfortable and it looks great. So if you could check that out, that would be much appreciated as well. But if you stick with us and tune in next fortnight, I've got a big one coming up next fortnight. One you might like as well, Mav, given who you said your other favorite wrestler is. We're talking about CM Punk. I've got Benno in from the podcast Grapple. We're going to talk about CM Punk versus Samoa Joe, CM Punk's last match in AEW. We're finally going to do it. I'm finally going to do it. I'm going to have the CM Punk podcast. We're going to talk about CM Punk in AEW. We're going to talk about Brawl Out. We're going to talk about Brawl In. We're going to go there. It's going to be interesting. We'll see how we go. But it will definitely be worth listening in on. So make sure you join me in a fortnight's time for that. Thanks again for listening. Thank you again, Mav, for being along with us today. And I will catch you all again next week. Bye. Thanks for listening to the AEW Match Guide podcast. If you enjoyed the show, then you can subscribe on the podcast app of your choice so you never miss an episode. Also, feel free to let me know on Twitter at @Sir_Samuel. I'd love to hear from you. The AEW Match Guide podcast is brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network, where you can find many other fantastic podcasts discussing not just AEW, but all parts of the world of professional wrestling. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Sam Brown.